these children are not just statistics, that each one has a name, a family, a home, and a right to their identity. And returning them must not be treated as a political negotiation, but as a moral and legal imperative.
Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal framework that underpins peace processes. You're listening to our special series focused on peace negotiations and peace building in Ukraine. Join us as we speak with lawyers, policymakers, and human rights defenders tackling some of the most pressing issues facing Ukraine today. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the president and the founder of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Among the gravest crimes committed during Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is the unlawful deportation and forcible transfer of Ukrainian children, a crime recognized by the International Criminal Court as grounds for war crimes charges against top Russian officials, including Russian President Putin. This episode focuses on the legal, humanitarian, and accountability dimension of this atrocity and what justice might look like, not only for the children who have been abducted, but for the families and the communities from which they were taken. I'm honored to have two amazing guests today. These two guests are at the forefront of advocacy and legal efforts to return the children of Ukraine to their parents and to their communities. Dr. Yulia Ioffe and Dr. Kateryna Rashevska. Thank you both very much for joining the program. Dr. Yulia is a Ukrainian legal scholar and human rights advocate. She holds a doctorate in law and specializes in international criminal law and child protection in times of conflict. Yulia is a senior advisor to several Ukrainian institutions working on the documentation of crimes committed against children and has published widely on the legal consequences of forced displacement. Kateryna is a legal expert at the Regional Center for Human Rights and a leading voice in advocating for accountability for the deportation of Ukrainian children. She has provided expert testimony and submissions to international bodies, including the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, and the Council of Europe. She also works closely with Ukraine's Office of the Ombudsman and the Coordination Council for the Protection and the Return of Children. Yulia and Kateryna, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Great. Well, let me go ahead and kick off with the first question. It's always great for our listeners to get to know our guests a little bit and to understand their journeys. So let's start with you, Kateryna. Can you share with our listeners your journey into the field of international criminal law and human rights, and particularly why it is you chose to specialize in crimes committed against children?
So actually, it is a great question because I started my education in the Institute of International Relations, being expected to become a diplomat and not an international lawyer. But very quickly, I understood that for me, it is more interesting to see how the international law, all these conventions, international treaties work in a real life. And of course, for me, the mission is to make this international law efficient, because as for today, many people, they are just disencouraged. They started thinking that maybe international relations are regulated not by law, but by force. And actually, it is partially true. That is why it's like a real task for me to not to persuade these people, but to demonstrate to them that sometimes we have real instruments to help people to fight for the recognition of the violations of their rights, and also to fight against impunity, and to guarantee the accountability for those who perpetrated all these violations. Before the full-scale invasion, the focus of my work was also on international criminal law, but mostly in the context of the occupation of the Crimean Peninsula. But after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, it became clear that it was just impossible to concentrate all efforts only on one occupied territories. I understood that the Russian Federation is trying to replicate, to repeat the Crimean scenario in newly occupied territories, especially when it comes to the deportation and forcible transfer of Ukrainian children. So I started focusing on the protection of the rights of the child because, first of all, I really like international law, but also I am keen of queer children. So all these issues, they are too close for me. It is not only about some legal work, it is also about my destiny.
Well, that's very impressive, Kateryna, in terms of this notion of making law real. All of us that practice in international law wonder sometimes if it's just theory. And I think in the context of children who've been abducted, the work that you do in utilizing these legal principles to actually find ways of holding individuals accountable or returning the children is an amazing indication of how international law can actually be real and make a difference. Yulia, go ahead and share with us your journey to international criminal law and your work in the space dealing with abducted children.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for having me on this incredibly important series. My journey into international law and the protection of children in armed conflict is rooted deeply in both my personal and professional background. As a Ukrainian legal scholar, I was already working on issues of international law, children's rights, and transitional justice before the full-scale invasion. But when the war intensified, we began to witness the systematic targeting of civilians, including children, and it became impossible for me not to focus all my efforts on this issue. But of course, as Kateryna already mentioned, forcible transfer of Ukrainian children started already in 2014, but the scale was very different. And I generally am a specialist on refugee children and children who are transferred or moved in the context of forced migration. I started focusing on refugee children in particular in my work at the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR in Kiev, Ukraine, but also in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And as you and probably our audience know, that the position and the rights of refugee children, they are on the intersection of different areas of international law, international refugee law, of course, but also international human rights law, international humanitarian law, international criminal law. So I've been doing that work for a while, but I also consider myself more of a generalist international lawyer. I had a privilege to work for His Excellency Judge Crawford at the International Court of Justice, where I focused on bigger international law questions of reparation, but also on genocide. And I'm sure we'll talk about genocide more in this conversation, and particularly the state responsibility side of things, not necessarily individual criminal responsibility. So all of this brought me to this particular topic, but I also mentioned a personal connection. I myself am from Donbas area. I spent my childhood in Lugansk Oblast. My family was fortunate enough to move away from the hostilities, but sometimes I do feel like it could have been someone from my family who would be deported. So this issue is also personally very close to my heart.
Yulia, I'm so grateful that you shared that personal dimension, because oftentimes, when the three of us have conversations with our peers and colleagues about international law, it tends to be theoretical or about the law, but there's real personal stories that drive our interest and that drive our commitment. So thank you for sharing what drives you on this issue. Kateryna, for our listeners, can you give us a big picture description of the situation? We talk about children being abducted, children being kidnapped, and we'll move into a conversation about those legal dimensions in a moment. But if you could just walk our listeners through the nature of these kidnappings, abductions, and the scale.
So what we should understand is that, yes, of course, approximately 20,000 Ukrainian children have been deported only since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and approximately 1,000 were deported from the occupied Crimean Peninsula between 2014 till 2022. But the deportation and forcible transfer are not just the goal itself. So the Russian Federation is not willing just to forcibly displace children to somewhere. The goal is to re-educate these children, to turn these children into the enemies of their proper nation. So the legal situation and the nature of the violation against Ukrainian children who were abducted but who are also in occupied territories is really similar. Because using the system of formal and informal education, the Russian Federation is trying to erase their Ukrainian identity, to Russify them, to brainwash them, also to militarize them. We see how this distorted version of the Russian patriotism is just imposed on these children and how efficient it is. Even in the context of the newly occupied territories, we see how children who were under Russian control in deportation or in occupation, they just started thinking that they are really Russians. Even if, for example, their parents are Ukrainian soldiers or they were captured by Russians and then detained somewhere incommunicado, or these parents were prisoners of war. So this propaganda, including the propaganda to serve into the Russian armed forces, has a very destructive nature. They also documented that every fifth child who is returned from the Russian control has some physical problems, problems with physical health. And every second child has mental problems. So just to demonstrate that we are not talking about something, humanitarian, about how to guarantee the safety and security for these children, or, for example, how to guarantee for them the right to education. Not. The Russian Federation is just trying to solve its own demographic problems using Ukrainian kids, including this need to guarantee the mobilization reserve in future. And that is why we see how this trends of the Russian behavior was changed during these 3 years of the full-scale invasion. Because if during the first months of the invasion, the Russian Federation was trying just to displace these children somewhere and to establish its control over these children, during 2023, 2024, the main goal was just to educate them, is just to introduce the elements of political indoctrination into formal education in order to cover as much children as possible. So I know that there are some lawyers and experts who don't agree that these crimes of the Russian Federation have genocidal nature. But as for me, and as per the idea of fair ranking, and also other lawyers who have been developing the Genocide Convention, I suppose that it is a clear sign of the crime of genocide, of the forcible transfer of children from one protected group to another protected group.
Well, Kateryna, thank you for laying that out for us, because oftentimes people think of this as, oh, children displaced in conflict, which is heart-wrenching and terrible, but that's only a thin slice or a thin dimension. This is about the Russians kidnapping Ukrainian children and brainwashing them, transforming them into Russians, basically changing their identity 180 degrees. And as you mentioned, this falls within the category of genocide. Yulia, let me bring you into this conversation. And can you give us the legal lens on the factual situation that Kateryna just described? How do lawyers think about this? How do lawyers characterize what's happening?
That's a very important question. Thank you, Paul. Legally, forcible transfer of children from occupied Ukrainian territories to the Russian Federation may violate a number of international legal provisions, particularly in international human rights law. Both Russia and Ukraine are parties to a number of international human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and specifically the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it seems from what we know that multiple provisions of that convention are being violated, particularly related to child's identity, as Kateryna mentioned, Article 8 of the CRC, but also other rights, particularly rights related to family life and family unity. Those are Articles 9 10 and 16. And there are other provisions that may be violated as well: protection from inhumane treatment, different cultural and educational rights. But apart from international human rights law dimension, international humanitarian law also prohibits deportations of civilian population, including children. And this is particularly mentioned in the Fourth Geneva Convention and Additional Protocol 1. Of course, there are some exceptions with regard to temporary evacuation of children, but those are possible only in limited circumstances with regard to health and safety. And there are certain requirements that have to happen, including making sure that there's some verification, providing education that it seems that Russia is not complying with. So forcible transfers of Ukrainian children likely violate those provisions. But most importantly, this action can also be characterized as international crimes under the Rome Statute. And we know that the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants with regard to President Putin and Commissioner Belova with regard to Article 8, which relates to war crimes. But these acts may be also qualified as crimes against humanity or genocide, as Kateryna mentioned. There is some disagreement even between international bodies in terms of how to qualify them. For example, the OSCE Moscow mechanism qualified these actions as crime against humanity, although the Council of Europe the Parliament Assembly qualified it as genocide. So there are possibility of qualification of these actions in different ways. And I'm on the same page with Kateryna. I do believe that this should be qualified as genocide, but I'm sure we'll talk more about this, that there are certain legal, technical, and evidentiary difficulties in terms of proving that this is genocide. In terms of Ukraine's legal community, we've taken multi-layered approach. First, Ukrainian legal experts and civil society organizations like Regional Center for Human Rights, where Kateryna works, have played a critical role in documenting and preserving evidence before we can qualify any of these actions as crimes. Of course, we need evidence to do that. Second, there is a strong emphasis on strategic litigation, and Ukrainian policy has been to target as many institutions as possible. So there were submissions to International Criminal Court, UN Human Rights Council, European Court of Human Rights. But it seems that the main body that is targeted is the International Criminal Court. And finally, there is a growing domestic legal framework in Ukraine designed to support accountability and eventually reintegration of these children. This includes legislative initiatives, coordination between governmental bodies, and ongoing advocacy for the return of these children.
Well, Yulia, you mentioned the difficulty of gathering evidence, and I want to drill down on that a little bit. Maybe let me turn to you, Kateryna, and if you could talk us through. Your team has done quite a bit of evidence collection relating to the abduction and kidnapping of children. It's clearly a very sensitive area in which to gather evidence. Can you walk us through how you and your team approach evidence gathering for this type of crime?
So we have several sources of information. We started our work documenting information from open sources. And frankly speaking, Russians were even not trying to hide the evidence of their own crimes. So we repeated that the Russians themselves are the best documentators of their violations. But after the issuance of arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova by the ICC, the situation was changed. And of course, now we see how the Russian propaganda is trying to legitimize, to explain everything, why it was something from the humanitarian sphere, why it was not an international crime, and so on and so forth. The mention about children who were forcibly transferred to Russian families is now not in open sources, but we know that the process is ongoing, as well as the process of depriving parents of their rights in occupied territories. So just to highlight that this fact that the number 19,546 is not changing during 2 years doesn't mean that the process of deportation was stopped. This is not the truth, because Russians are continuing their policy of transfer of Ukrainian children to the families of their own citizens in different subjects of the Russian Federation. During the first months of the full-scale invasion, close cooperation with some, let's name them volunteers from the Russian Federation, who really understood that maybe there was something wrong with all of this transfers, the evacuation of children to the territory of Russia. Some people even told us that amongst these children, there were very young kids who were not even able to remember their names and to tell their names from which families they were. And that is why we were trying to document everything and to pass this information to other competent bodies in order to return these children. And also, I would like to stress that as for today, our main priority and main goal is repatriation of children. And that is why when some database, they are not open for the Ukrainian side, or they are somewhere and not in Ukraine, something unique. So I am just asking myself what is the goal of collecting this information, because we should unify our efforts in order to accelerate the process of the return of Ukrainian children, because being under Russian control is harmful for them. Then first groups of children, not groups, but like separate children, they were returned from the Russian control. These children, they were mostly deported from Mariupol. Then they have managed to contact Ukrainian competent bodies or Ukrainian non-governmental organizations like SOS Children Villages or Save Ukraine, in order to ask some help and also in order to be returned to Ukraine. And according to the testimonies, also understood that there were more children under Russian control, their friends, their classmates, their neighbors, and all these children in the Ukrainian registers, all these numbers, they were also received based on the testimonies of children who have been already returned. As for today, we continue our work with children. We continue to interview them in order to receive more data. But as there are other non-governmental organizations who are doing the same work, our focus is to use all these testimonies, all these interviews, in order to prepare individual complaints to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and to help the children to receive the recognition of the violations of their rights, and also to raise the question about possible compensation. The process of identification of children is also ongoing. We have some troubles with it, not the Regional Center for Human Rights, but also Ukraine as a state. And of course, the main problem is the Russian Federation, which is violating its obligations according to international humanitarian law. But also, we have some changes inside our state. And the Ministry of Reintegration, who was managing this register previously, now is doesn't exist. And that is why Ministry of Justice is trying to verify everything, to verify all information. And I hope that very soon we will see new data, new information, and all these names and surnames, they will be included into the special list and then transferred during all this process of peaceful negotiations to Russia, in order to return these children to their legal representatives, to their families.
So you're teeing it up so when there are negotiations, the Ukrainian government will be able to put the list of names on the table and say, Article 1 of the peace agreement, please return, or you're obligated to return all of our children, and here's the annex with their names. Let's pick up on a little bit. I want to turn to Yulia to pick up on something Kateryna was talking about in terms of there has been some return of children, and there are legal and political efforts underway. Can you walk us through? Every once in a while, we hear about the return of some children. What legal and what political approaches are underway, and are you hopeful about their success?
Yes, it's true that while some children have been successfully returned, and so far we know that it's a little bit over 1,000 children out of 10,000 or maybe even 100,000 of children, but still they're home. And of course, every child is important, but the majority do remain in Russia or in Russian occupied territories. And generally, Ukraine has taken a multi-layered approach involving legal action, diplomatic initiatives, and humanitarian efforts. However, particularly with the legal efforts, unfortunately, international law focuses mostly on accountability for these crimes. And it doesn't really says a lot about return and repatriation. And I totally agree with Kateryna that repatriation and immediate repatriation of these children is very important and is a human tragedy that needs immediate action. And additionally, as we all know, enforcement in international law is a big issue. And Russia, unfortunately, has been violated a number of provisions of international law, not only with regard to children, but more generally, including international human rights law and humanitarian law. So there is a question in terms of enforcement, even if there is an obligation of returning of these children. So in terms of accountability, I think a lot of efforts have been put into this aspect, or of course, International Criminal Court, other international bodies, but also domestically, there are domestic cases of prosecuting these crimes. Of course, the documentation and reporting is very important. And again, Kateryna already mentioned that there is also an issue of changing the names of the children, the adoption of the children, where all the personal data has been changed. And this particularly is a very important issue with regard to younger children. We know some of the infamous cases, like the member of parliament of Russian Federation, Sergei Mironov, how they adopted a little girl from Kherson orphanage, and they changed all of her personal data, including first name, last name, and even the place of her birth. So documenting these children and collecting evidence is very important for identification and subsequent return. Also, it's worth acknowledging here the work of the Yale School of Public Health Humanitarian Research Lab. And it's unfortunate that the funding for this project has been stopped. Some of the news with regard to the database, whether it was deleted or not, are very troubling. And there is still, at the time of recording, we don't know what exactly is happening with the database, but I personally am worried about evidentiary value and whether the digital evidence would be admissible in court because of all the transfers into different databases. Related to documentation reporting, Ukraine works with international partners, including ICMP, to establish DNA database. Again, this is important for younger children. So family members are submitting DNA samples for further family reunification. There is a lot of discussion of interim reparation. Listeners might know that Ukraine started a pilot project with regard to urging interim reparations with regard to conflict-related victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And we are hoping that this project and pilot program would be extended to forcibly transferred children and their families. Of course, this very much depends on available funding and support by international partners. And finally, sanctions are quite important because of the pressuring of Russian authorities into returning children. A number of countries, including the UK, for example, issued personal sanctions with regard to Commissioner Maria Lvova-Belova. But it is necessary to continue this effort and target smaller bureaucratic leaders in the Russian Federation in order to pressure them into returning Ukrainian children. In terms of diplomatic efforts, Ukraine and Canada in 2024 launched an international coalition for the return of Ukrainian children, and now 41 countries joined this coalition, and they coordinate international efforts with regard to return of Ukrainian children. Ukraine also is building bilateral agreements and arrangements with different countries. Particularly recently, it had a number of meetings with Belgium in order to facilitate family reunification and support of return of these children. And finally, there are humanitarian efforts that go beyond the legal mechanisms. So again, there is initiatives spearheaded by the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, the Bring Kids Back UA initiative. That is an initiative that focuses on the repatriation of children, and a number of NGOs, for example, Save Ukraine, are supporting these efforts of returning children. But it's also worth noting that many of the children that are returned are of the category where they were sent away for holiday camps, and they have very present family members who who are able to go, for example, to Russia and try to retrieve those children. Unfortunately, it is not as successful. Return is not as successful with regard to children who were placed in orphanages and boarding schools or were separated from their parents during the filtration, even though most of those children have, if not parents, but family members. So despite all these efforts, unfortunately, returning is quite difficult because of all the reasons I've already mentioned, that Russia has a policy of Ukrainian children obtaining Russian citizenship, changing their names, changing their personal data, and also severing their ties with Ukrainian family members.
I appreciate that understanding of not only are they kidnapping and transforming the children into Russians, they're erasing and replacing their identity to make them difficult to find and bring back to their family and their parents. Well, you mentioned something, Yulia, that I want Kateryna to pick up on, and that is that most of the international law mechanisms deal with accountability. And in fact, the International Criminal Court has indicted President Putin and then Maria Lvova-Belova for the abduction, the kidnapping of children. Kateryna, could you walk us through the impact, both internationally and in Ukraine? Is it mostly symbolic? Is it politically important? Is it part of the cathartic process for victims, or is it just irrelevant international goings on?
So firstly, on March 17, 2023, when these two arrest warrants were issued, it was, like a victory. Everyone in Ukraine was just so happy, so encouraged. Everyone started thinking that maybe international law exists. But as for today, regarding the crisis of the International Criminal Code, partially because of the sanctions imposed by the United States, partially because the fact is that even the member states, they are not respecting some decisions of the ICC. In one case, it was when Mongolia welcomed Putin and not executed the arrest warrant. In the other case, it was Italy, which unfortunately also just allowed the general from Libya to return to his country without any concrete results as for his accountability at the international level. And then all this news about Hungary, which has decided just to not be the part of the ICC. And then all this news about possible non-execution of the arrest warrant against Netanyahu, and so on and so forth from the side of the European countries. Unfortunately, regarding this geopolitical situation, combined some non-respect of the international obligations, I am not so happy and persuaded that in the near future we will have some positive developments in the case of Ukraine, including the execution of the arrest warrant against President Putin, or some, some developments as for the passage to the next stage of the investigation, the last stage where it is possible to hear the case with the physical presence of President Putin and Lvova-Belova. Also, even if we are not talking about Russian president, but for example, other people from Russia, like generals, including Shoigu, ex-minister of the defense. In this case, I would hope to have some additional qualification in his arrest warrant regarding his role in the militarization of Ukrainian children in Russia and in occupied territory. But unfortunately, we still don't see any developments in this sphere, as well as possible issuance of additional arrest warrants regarding crimes against Ukrainian children, for example, for the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, or for other Russian high-ranking officials like Sergei Mironov or Anna Kuznetsova. But just not to finish, with these very pessimistic words, As for me, it is clear that maybe regarding the situation and the conception of the creation of the special tribunal for the Russian aggression against Ukraine, the ICC will be the unique body to hold accountable President Putin. And that is why we still hope. And we also doing our work related to preparing submissions to the ICC in order to push ICC to do its work. But we also understand the environment and the situation of this organization. And that is why we are ready to wait. As for today, and I will repeat, that the main priority is this repatriation of Ukrainian children. But what is also really disturbing that if the repatriation is now on the table during some technical consultations between parties, the question about accountability for the crime of deportation is not here. And not only for the crime of deportation, but actually the question of justice, of reparations, and so on and so forth. I would like to highlight that the Register of Damage for Ukraine will open a separate category as for deported and forcibly transferred civilians, including children. And that is why for these kids, this is also the mean to receive some financial compensation for their sufferings. But if the Russian Federation is not executing its obligations, and if the European states and other states who have these frozen Russian assets will not find some ways to confiscate them and to transfer them to the compensation fund. So they are just creating false expectations for people who survived all these crimes and violations. And it is also very harmful for the process of the reintegration of the return. So there are many difficult questions, issues, and also challenges related to the question of justice in this case. And everything is not just related to the situation inside the ICC.
No, Kateryna, what you've described happens so often with international law. A tribunal or a mechanism will issue a report, make an indictment, and then there's hope because there's acknowledgement, it's part of victim catharsis, there's a sense there's going to be accountability, and then either it leads to false expectations, or even worse, it's negotiated away at the peace negotiations. I'm hoping that's not going to be the case with Ukraine. And one reason why I'm hoping is because this question of genocide, and you've both mentioned it, and I want to turn to Yulia first, and then Kateryna, have you join in that conversation as well. Walk us through the application of the Genocide Convention to what is happening with Russia's kidnapping and deportation of children. And most people will say, well, it sounds like genocide, but they have trouble connecting the legal dots. If you could connect the legal dots for us under the Genocide Convention.
Sure. As we discussed, I think both Kateryna and I are persuaded that this actions may be genocide. And the reason for it is primarily the specific form of harm. Because in my opinion, it's not individual harm, but it's a harm that is aimed against collectivity. It's against Ukraine and Ukrainian national identity. Because if, again, war crimes qualification would be appropriate, in my opinion, if there were just forcible transfers. But as we discussed, the deportation is only the first step. And then further, there is an indoctrination process that includes both imposing of citizenship, adoption by Russian families. Russian families are also go through ideological education. Children are put in re-education camps. They have to go to Russian schools with Russian curriculum, study in Russian language, where they learn that Ukraine is not a real country, that their relatives are Nazis, and their opinion of the country and of where they come from is completely erased. And at the same time, again, as we discussed, they're completely separated from their families in Ukraine because they're dispersed all over the country. The ties with the families in Ukraine are severed. So if there was no this indoctrination element, I think it would have been fair to qualify it as a war crime. But because we do have this systematic policy, and we now also have evidence that it's a state policy on all levels of government, where both federal and national governments are involved, Ministry of Education, but also local governments, mayors, heads of orphanages, all involved in this process. So it is a systematic effort to Russify these children and to absorb them into the Russian national group. The difficulty with qualification of genocide is that, unfortunately, since Raphael Lemkin introduced this category, it became, in a way, a crime of all crimes, which, in my opinion, is not necessarily the best way to think about it. The way I think about it is that this crime aims at particular type of harm, which is collectivity and not individual crime. It's not more important or less important than other harms, but it's just different. But unfortunately, that's became the case, that especially with regard to more wider audience, if something is not a genocide, it's perceived as if it's not very important. Also, in my opinion, some of the decisions by international courts, particularly International Court of Justice, have interpreted genocide and particular genocidal intent quite narrowly, and in my opinion, a lot more narrower than was intended by the drafters of the convention. And the problem that we have now with this qualification is also that there are just not enough cases litigated both in international courts and domestically with regard to particularly forcible transfer of children at genocide. So doctrinally, we just have a lot of ambiguities in terms of parts of definition, particularly with regard to destruction. There are ambiguities whether it includes biological destruction and what biological destruction means when we talk about forcible transfer of children and not necessarily murder of children. There's a question of the overlap of cultural genocide and how this fits into the definition, and unrelated to forcible transfer of children specifically, but in Ukrainian case, one contentious issue is also the national group as the basis for destruction, because there is a lot of discussion of language being proxy for ethnicity or national group, and I think it is a bit more complicated in your Ukrainian case. There are Ukrainians who speak Russian, but they're still part of Ukrainian national group. There are Russians who speak Ukrainian. So it's a bit more complicated. And we haven't seen this issue elaborated in detail at least in international case law. So this could be, of course, opportunities to clarify those issues and to seek accountability in Ukrainian case, but also clarify it for international audiences. A question that was raised by Kateryna is that there is a risk because of all this narrow interpretations of genocide that we will increase the hopes of the victims and survivors. And then, for example, an international court wouldn't find enough evidence to prove that this was genocide. And this could be psychologically very painful for the survivors. So there is a question, it's an extra legal question on Ukrainian side, whether it is worth going through international litigation with regard to this particular question.
Yeah, I want to turn the microphone over to Kateryna in just a second. You've hit on two really important things, Julia. One is that the law hasn't necessarily caught up to the facts of how genocide is committed in contemporary times. And the second is there's this notion that it's the crime of all crimes. I work with so many clients who are experiencing more crimes against humanity, and they feel that they have to identify it as genocide in order for it to be taken seriously. And then, as you noted, it's complicated, and thanks to the International Court of Justice, it's been narrowed or constrained more than it probably should be. But Kateryna, jump in and share your thoughts on this question of genocide.
So, as Yulia has very well explained everything related to, the legal side of the qualification, I would like just to stress that as for me, the question is also with the political will, even of our partners, to recognize all these acts as a crime of genocide legally, not only politically. Because as for today, around 20 countries had recognized the deportation of Ukrainian children, the unreasonable delay in their repatriation, also their Russification as the crime of genocide. But this political recognition is not enough in order to push the case, for example, in the ICC, or at least at the national level, according to the principle of universal jurisdiction. Actually, we had a very meaningful discussion with representatives of one country of from among other partners. I will not mention the name of this country because I still hope that maybe we will have some success with this idea. But the idea was to try to qualify this political indoctrination and militarized re-education of Ukrainian children, or at least the cases of forcible transfer of Ukrainian children to Russian families, as a crime of genocide, taking into account the fact that even the European Court of Human Rights, in the context of this country, has recognized that its national understanding of the Genocide Convention is okay and not the violation of the Article 7 of the Convention of the European Human Rights Convention. So, but unfortunately, this discussion was 1 year ago. The government was changed, also the representative in the national parliament, and that is why they still don't have any case at the national level, even in the context of deportation, not mentioning the crime of genocide. This is our reality. So just to talk the talks and not to do something concrete at the national level legally. Also, we had some discussions with the representatives of the ICC in order to try to understand what is their vision. And maybe there is at least a very small chance to have this qualification as a crime of genocide at the level of the ICC. So what we heard is that the crime against humanity in the context of deportation, maybe yes, if they are able to prove that these actions they were committed large-scale and also with a systematic manner. But if no, so it remains the war crime. And in the context of genocide, not at all. Also, even the United Nations Commission of Inquiry was trying to prove the crime of genocide or just to find the elements of the crime of genocide, but even on their level, unfortunately, we still have only the qualification as a war crime and possibly crime against humanity. So sometimes I started thinking that maybe we had some instrumentalization of this issue and also some politicization of understanding of legal understanding of the crime of genocide. Also, the question is the fact that if we are qualifying all these acts as a crime of genocide, the question on the responsibility of other states for not preventing and not doing enough to stop this crime of genocide may raise according to the Genocide Convention. So what you are doing in order to stop the deportation of Ukrainian children? What are you doing in order to stop the forcible transfer to Russian families? And the last but not least, what have you done in order to stop these actions before the full-scale invasion? When Crimean orphans were transferred to Russian families every year, and we didn't have the mention about this crime even in the preliminary examination of the ICC. So there are many questions relating to the current situation with the recognition of these acts as the crime of genocide. And unfortunately, I suppose that it will be directly related to the situation on the battlefield and also to what we will agree with the Russian Federation during these technical consultations. Because if we are sacrificing the question of justice at all or just partially, so the question about qualification of these actions as the crime of genocide even will not raise.
The penultimate question for both of you, picking up on what you both said, is the international community doing enough on this topic of kidnapping and abducting children What more could it be doing? And do you have a sense that somehow, because this action is so atrocious, so unique, the international community somehow has difficulty focusing and providing assertive and aggressive support to Ukraine? Or is that a mischaracterization? So talk to us a little bit about the international community.
Of course, Ukraine and Ukrainians, we're very grateful for the support of the international community and solidarity. But I think there is an underestimation of the urgency and the scale of the crime. Now, it's been 10 years since the start of the war, 3 years, more than 3 years since the start of the full-scale invasion. These children are growing up in a completely different culture, in a different country, being Russified and indoctrinated. And it is very urgent to return them and to do something concrete. Again, we do appreciate all the solidarity and the kind words of support and also publicly shaming Russia for these actions. But unfortunately, a lot of those actions, as Kateryna said, there are a lot of words, but not enough concrete actions in terms of both accountability, but also trying to return those children. And again, this is a very time-sensitive issue because we're dealing with children, time passes. They're leading a completely different life. They're completely disconnecting from their backgrounds. And the more time goes on, the reality is the less children we can return and the more harm these children will endure.
Thank you, Yulia. Kateryna?
So, of course, I would like also to thank all our international partners because in comparison with what was before the full-scale invasion, I have already mentioned that unfortunately the response was not so powerful in order to prevent the repetition of the Crimean scenario after the full-scale invasion. As for today, you see that there are sanctions. There is a coalition for the return of Ukrainian children. We have enough money in order to return these children, to rehabilitate and to reintegrate them. And what we see is that this international solidarity is really international because even some countries from the global south, like Brazil or South Africa, or some Arabian states like Qatar, they are trying to do their best in order to help us to return kids. And in this sphere, it is also very useful to fight the Russian propaganda because what I see is that the Russian Federation is really willing to distort the reality and to try to manipulate with the presence of children under their control and to explain that these children are in Russia or in occupied territories because they love Russia and they think that they are all Russians as per today. So all these efforts they are appreciated, but what we really need, and I'm totally agree with Yulia that unfortunately the time is playing against us, and children are growing. Some children still wait. Even Russians are documenting some kids in boarding institutions who still wait their family members. But Russia continue not inform the Ukrainian competent bodies about these children under its control in order to facilitate the process of repatriation. So the main goal is to continue this pressure on the Russian Federation and to try to persuade the state to comply at least partially with its obligations. So we should start with the return of a big group of children. I understand it will not be 19,546, but at least 100 children who are in a very vulnerable situation, like, for example, children from Kherson Regional Child Home or Olashki boarding institutions. They are status children, so they can be easily transferred to Russian families, even for adoption. And that is why we should accelerate the process of their repatriation. And I am totally agree with the representatives of the United States who proposed to use this cooperation between Ukraine and Russia as, like some test for the Russian Federation to understand whether the state is really able to fulfill its obligations, at least in the sphere of the international humanitarian law and international child rights law. If the Russian Federation is returning Ukrainian children, so we can develop this cooperation in other spheres. If no, so how we can trust to the Russian Federation with our security guarantees if they are not able to comply with the existing obligations? So this is very important. But what I would like to highlight is that as for today, it is not enough just to return abducted children. And even it is not enough to guarantee that all perpetrators will be held accountable. We all understand that, unfortunately, at this stage of the war, the Russian Federation will control in future some part of Ukrainian territory. And that is why we should guarantee that this process of eradication of Ukrainian national identity in the occupied areas will be stopped. So no Russian educational standards, no Russian forcible passportization, no Russian colonizers from among Russian teachers, nothing about Russification of these territories. And of course, I am not so romantic and naive to think that the Russian Federation will accept such conditions, such requirements. But at least we should try, and we should push the Russian Federation should continue our countermeasures, sanctions, until the moment when all Ukrainian children, and this is not 20,000, this is more than 1,600,000 children who are now under Russian control in occupation, who should be returned in the Ukrainian controlled territories. So this is my vision, my position.
Well, Kateryna and Yulia, you've been very generous with your time today. I just have one last question, which you've both sort of touched on already. But what is your one takeaway that you want our listeners to remember and to think on and to act on with the situation of the kidnapping and the abduction of Ukrainian children by Russia? Yulia, then Kateryna.
Yes, I would like to leave the listeners with the thought that these children are not just statistics, that each one has a name, a family, a home, and a right to their identity. And returning them must not be treated as a political negotiation, but as a moral and legal imperative. And we shouldn't wait for peace agreements or the right moment to return them, and the returning of these children and reintegration in Ukrainian society should start now. And a related point is that we have a lot of political will where Ukraine is supported in this instance, but we also know from history that forcible transfers, deportation, kidnapping, assimilation of children has been going on for centuries in different contexts. So it is also important to think about Ukrainian example, something that would also lead the efforts in the future. So if there is no resolution, fair and legal resolution of this issue in Ukraine, I don't think children in other contexts would have a lot of hope of a different future.
Thank you, Yulia. Kateryna, one takeaway.
Very quickly. First of all, we should understand that the existing system of the international law related to the protection of children during armed conflict, unfortunately, is not working well in order not only prevent all these violations, but even to react efficiently in order to stop them, to repress them, and also to bring perpetrators to justice. And that is why we should contribute all together to the progressive development of the international law. Because if no, so the genocide will be repeated, the genocide will not be prevented, all these violations against children, they will be large scale and systematic. And that is why I am sure that countries will start thinking that maybe they should have something else in order to protect their future. Because if one country can stall just the whole generation or a very huge part of the generation, so maybe our world is not so perfect as well as the existing system of the international law. And the second point is related to the campaigns of raising awareness and also to this need to keep the issue of Ukrainian deported children in the agenda of the international community, despite all changes in internal political situation, despite all these geopolitical challenges, despite all policy questions. So, because when children are deported, when children are just ill-treated, so it is not normal for each and every person in our world. And that is why we should continue to repeat about the fight of these deported children till the moment when the last Ukrainian children who was deported will be under Ukrainian control.
Kateryna, thank you for sharing those thoughts, and Yulia as well. I wanted to thank both of you from the bottom of my heart for spending this last hour with me and with our listeners, helping us to get our head around the situation of the abduction, the kidnapping of Ukrainian children by Russia. It's been a real honor and a privilege to have this conversation. And also, I'm incredibly grateful, as so many people are, for the work that you do in this area for these children. And I have to say that I'm awestruck by your ability to get up every day and deal with an issue that's not only so important, but is so heart-wrenching. And the fact that you're out there on a daily basis fighting for these children gives people like me hope that we may be able, through passion, advocacy, and international law, to nudge the world towards being a better place. So thank you very much for joining us, and really thank you for all that you do for the children of Ukraine.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for the invitation.